A howling, colorless wind swept across the frozen plains of Sci-Fi, its abandoned terraforming stations half buried in drifting snow. No living soul had passed here in over 3 winters. The sky above hung low and heavy, a sheet of hammered metal pressed against the horizon. Visibility extended barely 20 paces before dissolving into swirling white chaos. This was a place where hope came to die, where dreams froze solid and shattered at the slightest touch. Beneath the battered remains of a collapsed dome, Sherian cradled her infant daughter Lyri with trembling arms. Her pale blue skin, normally luminescent under proper light, had faded to a dull periwinkle. Her ceremonial robes, once vibrant with the sacred geometries of her people, were now wet with blood and ice. Her hair, like snowdrift threads, clung to her hollow cheeks. Each labored breath formed clouds that dissipated into the frozen air of their makeshift shelter. "Sleep, little spark," Sherian sang in a cracked voice, each syllable of the ancient lullaby emerging as a desperate plea against the relentless cold. The language was not human. It contained tones beyond what human vocal cords could produce, subtle harmonics that spoke of stars and void journeys. "May your spirit sail gentle rivers beyond the reach of snow and shame. May your dreams grow warm and golden far from those who fear your flame." The infant stirred weakly in her arms. Lyri's skin, a shade paler than her mother's, was edged with an alarming gray. Her tiny fingers clutched reflexively at the edge of the thermal wrap, but the movement lacked the vigor it had possessed mere hours ago. Sherian pressed cracked lips to her daughter's forehead, measuring the fading warmth there. The child's temperature was dropping despite everything. Sherian had fled the Warren cities with nothing but emergency supplies and the clothes on their backs. The genetic purity mandates had reached her sector just days after Lyri's birth, when the medical monitors discovered the twin gene patterns the consensus had declared impure, dangerous, anomalous. The alert had sounded while Sherian was still healing from the birth. She remembered the flash of panic when the monitors began to pulse red, how she'd torn the sensor pads from her skin and disconnected Lyri from the nutrient flow. They'd barely escaped through the maintenance tunnels, ducking past security drones, crawling through fractured corridors, choked with ancient dust and forgotten cables. Sherian's kind, the memory bearers, had been tolerated for generations, as curiosities, as living archives, storing cultural information deemed too sensitive for the public networks. But the latest genetic purism wave had rebranded them as anomalies, hazards to the carefully maintained genetic equilibrium. And Lyri, with her unique twin-pattern genes, violated 3 separate purity protocols. The consensus would have corrected her, a sterile term for a horrific procedure that would have hollowed out everything that made her daughter special, everything that made her Lyri. So they had run, and kept running until the city domes disappeared behind them, and the undeveloped wilds of Sci-Fi stretched before them, beautiful, deadly, and indifferent to their plight. "I promised you starlight," Sherian whispered between verses of the lullaby, her voice breaking. "I promised you gardens and stories and summers without end. Forgive me, little spark, forgive me." The wind outside howled, like something wounded throwing itself against the remains of the dome. Flakes of snow drifted through cracks in the structure, settling on Lyri's blanket. Sherian brushed them away with numb fingers. The cold had become a physical presence, a weight pressing against them both. Her thoughts were growing sluggish, which she recognized as the first stage of hypothermia. She forced herself to continue singing, to keep moving her hands, to maintain the fragile connection to consciousness that was all that stood between Lyri and the endless sleep of the snow. Sherian had known the odds when she fled. The wilderness of Sci-Fi had claimed countless lives before. The planet's terraforming had been abandoned decades ago when the funding dried up, leaving behind a world caught between habitability and hostility. The atmospheric processors had stabilized enough to create breathable air, but the temperature regulation had failed catastrophically. What should have been temperate plains had become a frozen wasteland. The handful of hardy settlers who remained clung to the geothermal stations, huddled around artificial heat, while the endless winter raged outside. Sharian had hoped to reach one of those settlements outpost Ember, according to her outdated data chip, but the storm had disoriented her. The shelter of the collapsed dome was meant to be temporary, just long enough to wait out the worst of the blizzard. But Lyri's strength was waning faster than expected, and Sharian's own reserves were dangerously depleted. Her song faltered as her voice gave out raw from hours of singing against the wind. She pulled Lyri closer, trying to share what little body heat remained between them. She couldn't feel her toes anymore. The pain in her fingertips had given way to a disturbing numbness. How much longer before her core temperature dropped below sustainable levels? How much longer before Lyri's tiny body surrendered to the cold? The memory bearers had many stories about death. They spoke of it not as an ending, but as a doorway, a passage into a realm of pure memory, where consciousness dissolved into a collective, ancestral stream. Sharian had always found comfort in those stories, but now they felt hollow. There would be no one to remember Lyri, no one to carry forward the brief flicker of her existence. They would disappear here, their bodies eventually buried beneath the drifting snow, and no one would mark their passing. "Please," she whispered, though she didn't know who she was addressing, the storm, the abandoned planet, or some distant deity who might be listening, despite all evidence to the contrary. "Please." Not her. "Take me if you must, but spare her." The wind seemed to pause, as if considering her request. For a moment the howling subsided, and in that strange pocket of silence, Sharian heard it, a crunch of boots on ice. Distinct, purposeful, human. She froze mid-phrase, the lullaby dying on her lips. Her pulse quickened, sending blood to extremities that had been neglected for too long, creating a surge of painful tingling. She gripped Lyri tighter, wincing as her stiff fingers protested the sudden movement. The footsteps grew closer, deliberate and unhurried. Sharian pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the dome's remains, calculating her options. Flight was impossible. Her legs would barely support her weight, let alone carry her and Lyri through the snow. Combat was equally unthinkable in her weakened state. That left hiding or pleading for help, neither of which promised much hope of survival. Humans hunted anomalies for the bounty the consensus offered. Her kind had learned that lesson through bitter experience. A silhouette appeared at the jagged opening that served as the shelter's entrance. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in layers of what appeared to be patched sin leather. For a long moment, the figure stood motionless, backlit by the diffuse glow of the snow-reflected light. Then he stepped forward, ducking to clear the low ceiling of the collapsed section. His face emerged from shadow, human male, weathered by exposure and time. Jonas Vaughn stood at the rim of Sharian's shelter, his eyes hollow with years of silent guilt. Those eyes, locked onto the huddled forms of mother and child, widening slightly at the sight of Sharian's blue skin. "Memory bearer," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Not a question, a recognition. Sharian said nothing, her arms tightening protectively around Lyri. She noted the bat clipped to his belt, the standard-issue shock weapon favored by bounty hunters and security forces. His hand twitched near it, but didn't reach for it yet. "How long have you been here?" he asked, glancing around the decaying structure. Sharian remained silent, weighing her options. Each word spent was energy wasted, and she had precious little to spare. The man Jonas stepped further into the shelter, his boots crunching on ice crystals that had formed on the inner surface of the dome. He moved with a caution that spoke of experience, keeping his distance from her, while cataloging the meager contents of their refuge. "Your child needs medical attention," he observed, his gaze falling on Lyri's still form. "And you're heading for hypothermia if you're not already there." Sharian's cracked lips parted. "We require nothing from you, human." Her voice emerged as a whisper, barely audible above the resumed howling of the wind. "Continue your journey." Jonas's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. "There's a relay station 2 kilometers northeast. Abandoned, but the emergency systems should still function." Better shelter than this. He gestured at the crumbling dome around them. You won't survive the night here. And why would you care if we survive the night? Sherian challenged, drawing on her last reserves of strength to inject defiance into her tone. Jonas's hand moved, causing Sherian to flinch, but he was only reaching into an inner pocket of his coat. He withdrew a cylindrical object, which he activated with a twist. The emergency heat gel package began to glow, with a soft orange light, warming rapidly. He tossed it toward her, careful to place it within reach without coming too close. Take it, he said. It's enough to stave off hypothermia until we reach the station. Sherian eyed the heat gel with naked longing, but didn't move to retrieve it. I'm heading there myself, Jonas replied, with forced casualness. You're welcome to follow or stay and freeze. Your choice. The heat, radiating from the package, was already reaching her, a tantalizing promise of warmth. Leary stirred in her arms instinctively, turning toward the heat source. That tiny movement decided Sherian. Her daughter might still have a chance, however slim, and that was worth any risk. If you attempt to harm her, Sherian said, her voice stronger now, know that memory bearers can die in ways that ensure we are not forgotten. Our vengeance persists beyond death. Jonas's expression didn't change, but he inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. Noted. He turned toward the entrance. Can you walk? Sherian shifted Leary to one arm, cradling her securely against her chest, and used her free hand to grasp the heat gel package. The warmth against her palm was almost painful after so long in the cold. I will manage. She struggled to her feet, swaying slightly, as blood rushed from her head. Tiny needles of sensation pricked along her limbs, as circulation began to return to frost-numbed extremities. She took an experimental step, then another, forcing her stiff legs to comply with her will. Jonas watched her progress without offering assistance, which Sherian appreciated more than she would admit. Physical contact with a stranger, a human stranger at that, would have been more than she could bear in her vulnerable state. He seemed to understand this instinctively, maintaining a respectful distance as he led the way back into the storm. The journey to the relay station was nightmarish. The wind had intensified, driving particles of ice against any exposed skin with savage force. Visibility had decreased further, the world beyond arm's length, dissolving into a howling void of white. Sherian focused on placing one foot before the other, on protecting Leary from the worst of the gale, on following the dark shape of Jonas's back, as he forged a path through deepening drifts. Time lost meaning in the storm's embrace. It might have been minutes or hours before a dark structure loomed before them, angular and artificial against the organic chaos of the blizzard. Jonas approached a snow-encrusted panel, beside what appeared to be an entrance, and brushed away the accumulated ice. His fingers, protected by thermal gloves, moved with surprising dexterity, manipulating controls beneath the frozen surface. A grinding sound emanated from within the structure, followed by a hiss of hydraulics. A door panel slid sideways, revealing a dark interior. Jonas gestured for Sherian to enter first, which she did with wary steps, all senses alert for danger despite her exhaustion. The interior of the relay station was cold, but blessedly free from the wind's fury. Emergency lighting activated at their presence, casting a dim blue glow over abandoned workstations and equipment. Jonas sealed the door behind them, then moved purposefully toward a control panel on the far wall. After a series of adjustments, a low hum vibrated through the floor, and warmth began to seep from vents near the ceiling. Geothermal system. Jonas explained, noting Sherian's questioning glance. Taps into the planet's core heat. Should warm up in here soon. Sherian nodded, already feeling the difference as the ambient temperature began to rise. She surveyed their new shelter with cautious optimism. The relay station was small, but intact, designed to house maintenance workers during the planet's initial colonization phase. There were basic amenities, a food preparation area, sanitation facilities, and what appeared to be sleeping quarters through a side doorway. You can put her down there, Jonas said, indicating a flat surface that might once have been a diagnostic table. He was busy laying down crude mats beside the geothermal vents, creating a makeshift sleeping area where the heat concentration would be greatest. Sherian hesitated, then carefully placed Leary on the indicated surface. The child whimpered softly as the heat gel package was momentarily removed, then quieted, as Sherian quickly wrapped her more securely in the thermal blanket. Now that they were out of immediate danger, Sherian could properly assess her daughter's condition. Leary's breathing was shallow, but steady, her pulse weak, but regular. The gray tinge to her skin was fading, replaced by a more natural pale blue. Her eyes remained closed, but there was movement beneath the delicate lid, signs of dream activity, which Sherian chose to interpret as positive. "She needs fluid and nutrients," Sherian said more to herself than to Jonas. "The cold depletes reserves quickly in one so young." Jonas approached, keeping a respectful distance, but extending his hand. In his palm lay several sealed packages, nutrient sachets and water containers, standard emergency rations. "These should help," he said. "Not exactly gourmet, but they'll restore electrolytes." Sherian accepted the offerings with a nod of thanks. She expertly pierced one of the water containers and moistened Leary's lips, allowing tiny droplets to be absorbed by the parched tissue. After several minutes of this patient work, Leary's tongue emerged to seek more moisture, and Sherian felt tears of relief prick at her eyes. Jonas had retreated to the far side of the room, busying himself with checking the station systems. The distance he maintained was clearly deliberate, giving her space, avoiding any appearance of threat. Sherian appreciated the consideration, even as she remained wary of his motives. "Why are you helping us?" she asked, finally, her voice low, to avoid disturbing Leary, who had drifted back to sleep after consuming a small amount of nutrient liquid. Jonas didn't turn from the console he was examining. "Does it matter?" "It does to me," Sherian replied. "Humans don't typically assist anomalies without reason." A muscle in Jonas's jaw tightened visibly, though his expression remained neutral. "Let's just say I once let someone like you die," he said, after a long pause. "It doesn't sit well." Sherian absorbed this information in silence. There were depths to that statement that she didn't have the energy to plumb just yet. She focused instead on the immediate needs of her child and herself, accepting the gift of temporary safety, without relaxing her vigilance entirely. As the hours passed, the relay station grew genuinely warm. Sherian removed her outer layers, hanging the sodden garments near vents to dry. She accepted the nutrient sachets Jonas offered, replenishing her own strength, while continuing to administer small amounts to Leary at regular intervals. Jonas maintained his distance, speaking little. He seemed content to work on various systems within the station, reactivating dormant equipment, and taking inventory of available supplies. At one point, he left briefly, venturing outside despite the ongoing storm. When he returned, his expression was grim. "Found this half buried in the snow about 50 meters out," he said, placing an object on a workbench. It was a tracking node, its casing cracked, but its antenna still occasionally sparking with weak electrical activity. "Someone was hunting you." Sherian's blood ran cold, despite the warmth of the room. She instinctively moved closer to Leary's sleeping form. "The consensus doesn't forget anomalies," she said quietly. "Especially those who escape correction." Jonas studied the damage tracker with a professional eye. "This is military grade," he observed. "Not standard bounty hunter equipment." "They don't send bounty hunters for memory bearers," Sherian replied, an edge of bitterness in her tone. "We know too much. They send specialists." Jonas's gaze sharpened with interest. "What exactly do they think you know?" Sherian's expression closed like a door slamming shut. "Enough." Jonas didn't press the issue. He deactivated the tracker with practiced movements, removing its power source and crushing the remaining circuitry beneath his boot heel. "It's dead now," he said. "But if they sent one, they probably sent others. We'll be gone by morning." Sherian, stated, managing to infuse certainty into her voice, despite the fear clutching at her heart. Where they would go, she had no idea, but staying in one place for too long was tantamount to suicide. "The storm won't let up for at least another day," Jonas countered. "Your child needs rest and recovery time. This place is shielded against most standard scanning technologies. It was built that way, to prevent signal interference with the relay functions." Sherian wanted to argue, but exhaustion was rapidly overtaking her, and what Jonas said made sense. Leary needed time to regain strength before facing the wilderness again. "We leave as soon as the storm breaks," she conceded. Jonas nodded and returned to his work, leaving Sherian to settle beside her daughter on the mats he had arranged. Despite her intention to remain vigilant, sleep claimed her almost immediately, her body surrendering to the demands of recovery. She woke sometime later to the sound of soft humming. For a disorienting moment she thought she was back in the Warren cities, in her quarters before everything had shattered. Then reality reasserted itself, and she identified the source of the humming: Jonas seated at a workbench, repairing what appeared to be communication equipment. The melody was unfamiliar, but there was something about it that tugged at Sherian's memory, a cadence similar to the lullabies of her own people. She remained still, feigning continued sleep, watching through barely opened eyes as the human worked. His movements were precise, economical, speaking of years of practice. The hollowness she had noted in his gaze earlier was less pronounced now that he was absorbed in his task. There was something almost peaceful in his expression, as if the work provided a form of meditation. A small sound from Leary drew both their attention. The child's violet eyes flickered open, lucid, and aware for the first time in many hours. She blinked at the unfamiliar surroundings, then focused on Jonas with innocent curiosity. "Your coat," she said in her small, clear voice, "is like smoke and soap." Jonas appeared startled, both by the child's sudden speech and by her oddly poetic observation. After a moment, a genuine smile cracked his weathered features, transforming his face entirely. "Is that good or bad?" he asked, his tone gentler than Sherian had yet heard from him. Leary considered the question with serious concentration. "Good," she decided finally. "Smoke keeps warm, soap makes clean." A startled laugh escaped Sherian, the sound rusty from disuse. Both Jonas and Leary turned to her, the former with surprise, the latter with delight. "Mama!" Leary exclaimed, reaching for her. Sherian gathered her daughter into her arms, pressing her face into the child's neck to hide the sudden surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. Leary was alert, speaking, noticing details, all signs that the worst had passed. "How do you feel, little spark?" Sherian asked, running her hands over Leary's limbs to check for any signs of frostbite or injury. "Hungry," Leary replied promptly, "and my fingers tingle." "The tingling is good," Jonas interjected. "Means circulation is returning properly." He approached cautiously, offering another nutrient sachet, this one designed specifically for children, Sherian noted with surprise. This should be easier for her to digest than the standard rations. Sherian accepted it with a nod of thanks. As she helped Leary consume the contents, Jonas retreated again, giving them space while remaining within conversational distance. "You have a kid's ration," Sherian observed. "Unusual for a solitary traveler." Jonas's expression tightened momentarily. "I was part of a colony transport team," he said, after a pause. "Before the funding dried up and the project was abandoned. Had to forge identities to get the remaining colonists off-world when the company decided cutting losses was more important than keeping promises." Sherian absorbed this information. "You were a forger." Jonas shrugged. "Among other things. Mostly I buried ghosts in crates, made people disappear from the system, so they could start over elsewhere." "And now you wander this frozen wasteland alone," Sherian observed, "carrying children's rations." A shadow passed over Jonas's features. "Old habits," he muttered. "Never know when they might be needed." Leary, who had been listening to this exchange with bright-eyed interest, suddenly extended her small hand toward Jonas. "I'm Leary," she announced formally. Mama named me before we ran. Sherian tensed, but made no move to silence her daughter. Names held power in memory-bearer culture, but the harm was already done. Besides, something told her that Jonas was not the sort to use a child's name against her. Jonas regarded the tiny blue hand solemnly, then extended his own, massive palm, allowing Leary to place hers upon it, without actually closing his fingers around hers, a gesture of greeting rather than capture. "I'm Jonas," he replied with equal formality. "It's an honor to meet you, Leary." The child beamed, revealing tiny teeth like polished pearls. "Will you stay with us now?" she asked artlessly. "Mama sings better when she's not scared." Sherian felt heat rise to her cheeks, but Jonas merely smiled that transformative smile again. "I'm going the same way for a while," he said diplomatically. "If that's all right with your mother." Leary turned expectant violet eyes to Sherian, who found herself nodding despite her reservations. "For now," she qualified, "until the storm passes." Satisfied with this answer, Leary returned her attention to the nutrient sachet, apparently content with the new arrangement. Sherian met Jonas's gaze over her daughter's head, a silent communication passing between them, an acknowledgement of the fragile trust beginning to form, and of the dangers that still waited beyond their temporary sanctuary. The day passed in a strange, suspended calm. The storm continued to rage outside, but within the relay station a cautious routine developed. Jonas continued his work on the station systems, occasionally sharing discoveries, or asking Sherian's opinion on technical matters. Sherian tended to Leary, whose strength returned with remarkable speed, once proper nutrition and warmth were restored. The child explored their shelter with infectious curiosity, examining every console and container within reach, chattering in the mixture of memory-bearer language and common speech that was natural to her age. As night approached, or what passed for night on a planet where the sun was rarely visible through perpetual storm clouds, Jonas produced more emergency rations and heated them using one of the station's functional cooking elements. The resulting meal was bland but nourishing, and they ate in companionable silence, broken only by Leary's occasional questions or observations. After the meal, Leary grew drowsy despite her earlier rest. Sherian settled her on the sleeping mats, tucking the thermal blankets securely around her small form. Almost reflexively, she began to sing the lullaby from earlier, her voice stronger now and more melodic. The ancient words flowed more smoothly in the relative security of the station, the harmonics truer and richer. Jonas listened without comment, his expression unreadable. When Leary had drifted into sleep, he spoke softly to avoid waking her. "That song," he said. "What does it mean?" Sherian traced a gentle finger along Leary's cheek. "It's a memory song," she explained. "We sing them to our children to connect them to our collective past. This one speaks of journeys between stars, of finding home in unlikely places." "Appropriate," Jonas observed. Sherian nodded. Memory bearers believe that songs carry more than just words, they carry the emotional resonance of generations. When I sing to Leary, I'm not just soothing her to sleep. I'm connecting her to ancestors she never met, to a heritage that the consensus would erase. Jonas was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I had a sister," he said finally, the words emerging as if forced through a narrow opening. "When the purity mandates reached our sector, she was identified as carrying a genetic marker for empathic sensitivity, a trait the consensus deemed disruptive to social harmony." Sherian went very still, sensing the weight of the confession. "What happened?" "I was supposed to forge her new identity, help her escape off-world." Jonas continued, his voice flat. "I waited too long, tried to perfect the documentation. They found her before we could implement the plan." He stared at his hands. "They offered me amnesty in exchange for my skills. I refused and ran. Been running ever since." "I'm sorry," Sherian said softly, the words inadequate but sincere. Jonas shrugged the gesture, a poor disguise for the pain evident in his posture. "It was a long time ago. But when I saw you and Leary in that collapsed dome." He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. Sherian understood. Redemption was a powerful motivator, especially for those carrying the weight of past failures. She might not trust Jonas completely, but she recognized the authenticity of his guilt and his desire to atone. The conversation might have continued, but a low rumble interrupted the moment, a vibration that started in the floor and quickly intensified. Emergency lights began to flash as the steady hum of the geothermal system transformed into an ominous grinding. Jonas was on his feet, instantly moving toward the main control console. "Seismic activity," he announced, scanning the readings with growing concern. "The ice beneath the station is fracturing." Sherian gathered the still sleeping Leary into her arms, heart pounding. "How bad?" Jonas's expression told her everything before he spoke. "Bad. The geothermal core is showing signs of rupture. If the vents collapse..." He didn't need to finish. They both knew what that meant. Without the heat source, the station would freeze solid within hours, or worse, collapse entirely, as the unstable ground beneath it gave way. The rumbling intensified, sending loose objects clattering to the floor. A crack appeared in one wall, zigzagging from floor to ceiling with alarming speed. Dust and frost rained down from overhead as the station's structural integrity began to fail. "We need to evacuate," Jonas said, already gathering essential supplies into a pack. "I have a crawler parked in a maintenance bay on the east side, if we can reach it." A violent jolt cut him off, nearly knocking them both off their feet. Leary woke with a frightened cry, clinging to Sherian's neck. The main lights failed, leaving only the pulsing red of the emergency system. Jonas moved with decisive speed to the control panel. "I need to override the hatch controls," he explained, fingers flying across the interface. "Standard procedure is to lock down during seismic events, but that would trap us inside." Sherian clutched Leary close, shielding her from falling debris, as another tremor shook the station. The child whimpered but remained surprisingly calm, her violet eyes wide and solemn, as she observed the crisis unfolding around them. "Mama," she whispered, "the heart of the world is angry." Something in her phrasing caught Sherian's attention, triggering a memory stored deep in her ancestral knowledge. Memory bearers had records of Sci-Fi from before the terraforming project, ancient scans that had detected unstable tectonic activity. The corporations had ignored those warnings, focusing instead on the planet's rich mineral resources. Could this be the consequence of that short-sightedness coming due? "Jonas," she called out, raising her voice to be heard over the growing cacophony of groaning metal and cracking ice. "This isn't just a localized event. The entire geothermal network could be failing." Jonas looked up from the console, his expression grim. "The diagnostics are showing cascading failures across the grid," he confirmed. "But there's something else. The station's memory core contains research data that was never uploaded to the central archives. If it's destroyed..." Sherian understood his hesitation. Scientific data was precious, especially on a forgotten world like Sci-Fi. But the tremors were growing stronger, and Leary's safety had to be her priority. "We need to leave now," she insisted. "No data is worth our lives." Jonas's hand hovered over the console, his expression torn. The memory core represented years of research information that might never be recovered if lost. But the building shuddered again, more violently than before, and a section of ceiling collapsed mere meters from where they stood. In that split second, Jonas made his choice. He abandoned the console and lunged for the manual override, yanking on a physical lever that controlled the emergency exit. The blast door slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a swirling wall of white beyond. "This way!" he shouted, grabbing the pack of supplies and leading them toward the exit. The wind struck like a physical blow as they emerged from the station, driving snow and ice particles against exposed skin with painful force. Jonas bent against the gale, creating a partial windbreak with his body as he guided them around the building's exterior toward the maintenance bay. The ground beneath their feet continued to shift and crack, making each step treacherous. Sherian focused on keeping her balance while protecting Leary from the worst of the storm. The child had buried her face against her mother's neck, tiny hands clutching the fabric of Sherian's robe with surprising strength. They reached the maintenance bay, just as a massive quake sent them stumbling against the exterior wall. Jonas punched in an access code, and the door slid open to reveal a cavernous space, housing various vehicles and equipment, most long abandoned. In the center sat a battered crawler, a multi-terrain vehicle designed for surveying operations, its reinforced treads and armored hull built to withstand the harsh Sci-Fi environment. Jonas helped Sherian and Leary into the passenger compartment before climbing into the driver's seat. The crawler's engine came to life with a reassuring hum, displays illuminating the interior with a soft blue glow. Through the reinforced viewport, they watched as another section of the relay station collapsed in a cloud of snow and debris. "Hold on," Jonas warned, engaging the crawler's drive system. The vehicle lurched forward, crashing through the partially collapsed bay door and out into the storm. The wind screamed over the hull as Jonas navigated by memory and instrument readings, following a route that only he could see through the whiteout conditions. Inside the crawler, the howl of the storm was muted to a persistent background noise. Warmth began to seep from the vehicle's heating system, and Sherian felt some of her tension ease as Leary relaxed against her. The child's eyes were drooping despite the drama of their escape, her small body surrendering to exhaustion now that immediate danger had passed. "She should rest," Jonas said, glancing over at them. "We have a long journey ahead." Sherian arranged Leary more comfortably on her lap, wrapping a thermal blanket from the supplies around her small form. "Where are we going?" she asked, realizing that she had never questioned their destination. Jonas's eyes remained on the navigation display. "There's a place more rumor than documented location where the geothermal activity takes a different form. A hidden valley where steam vents feed moss beds instead of powering stations. It might be our best chance for shelter now that the grid is failing." Sherian felt a flicker of hope at his words. A natural heat source independent of the failing terraforming infrastructure could mean survival. "How far?" "A day's journey in good conditions," Jonas replied grimly. "In this storm with seismic activity increasing, I don't know. But we can't go back and we can't stay in place." Sherian nodded, accepting the uncertainty. They had few options and fewer resources. All they could do was move forward and hope that Jonas's rumored sanctuary existed and could be reached before their supplies ran out or the crawler's power cells depleted. As they traveled, Leary slept between them, bundled in thermal blankets, her face peaceful, despite the chaos they had fled. Sherian monitored the geothermal readings on a secondary display, watching with growing alarm as stability indicators across the region shifted from cautionary yellow to urgent red. Jonas navigated with intense concentration, every decision potentially the difference between survival and disaster. The hours blurred together, marked only by the changing patterns of the storm and the occasional violent jolts as the crawler navigated particularly unstable terrain. They spoke little, conserving energy and focus for the journey. When Leary woke briefly, Jonas offered her a nutrient bar, which she accepted with solemn gratitude. She remained remarkably calm throughout, as if sensing that fear would only complicate their situation. Near what Sherian estimated was midday, they reached a critical juncture, a fork in their path, with unstable readings in both directions. Jonas hesitated, studying the navigation system with a frown. "The western route is shorter," he said, "but the seismic readings are more volatile." Sherian studied the display, then closed her eyes, accessing ancestral memories that contained geographical data from before the terraforming. "The eastern path," she said, with sudden certainty. "The western route crosses an ancient fault line that the terraforming charts didn't document." Jonas glanced at her, then nodded, adjusting their course without question. They had traveled less than a kilometer when a massive tremor shook the ground behind them, and the view screen showed a catastrophic collapse, where the western route would have taken them. A chasm had opened, swallowing everything in its path. Had they chosen differently, they would now be plummeting into darkness. "How did you know?" Jonas asked quietly, once they were safely past the danger zone. Sherian met his gaze steadily. "Memory bearers don't just preserve cultural knowledge. We maintain geological, astronomical, and biological records that predate human colonization efforts. The corporations ignored our warnings about Sci-Fi's instability. They found it more profitable to discredit us as superstitious anomalies than to adjust their terraforming plans." Understanding dawned in Jonas's expression. "That's why memory bearers are targeted by the consensus. You know the truth about what they've done to these worlds." Sherian nodded gravely. "Knowledge is dangerous to those who profit from its absence." Their partnership solidified in that moment, a shared understanding that went beyond the immediate crisis. They were both fugitives from a system built on willful ignorance and controlled information, both fighting in their own ways to preserve what the consensus would erase. As the day progressed, the storm began to abate slightly, allowing brief glimpses of the landscape around them. The terrain was changing, becoming more varied as they left the flat plains behind and entered an area of rising hills and deeply carved valleys. According to the navigation system, they were approaching the coordinates Jonas had targeted, though whether they would find sanctuary or another disappointment remained to be seen. Leary stirred again, this time fully awake and curious about their surroundings. She pressed her small face against the viewport, watching in fascination as snow crystals swirled in complex patterns against the transparent surface. "Look, Mama," she said, suddenly pointing to a section of the control panel where a small data pad lay. "May I?" Sherian hesitated, then nodded permission. Leary retrieved the pad, and a stylus settling cross-legged on the seat between them. Her small fingers moved with surprising dexterity as she began to draw, her brow furrowed in concentration. After several minutes of silent work, she held up the pad for their inspection. On it was a crude but recognizable drawing, 3 figures standing beneath what appeared to be a rocket ship, all surrounded by a smiling sun. The figures were clearly meant to represent the 3 of them. One tall with dark hair, Jonas, one slender with pale hair, Sherian, and one small with disproportionately large eyes, Leary. "That's us," Leary explained unnecessarily. "Going to the warm place." Jonas looked at the drawing with an expression that Sherian couldn't quite decipher. Something between pain and wonder crossed his features, and then, to her surprise, he allowed himself a genuine laugh, warm and unguarded. "It's perfect," he told Leary, who beamed with pride. The child's simple act of creation, her instinctive depiction of them as a unit, a family, shifted something in the atmosphere between the adults. There was an unspoken acknowledgement that whatever happened next, they were now bound together by more than circumstance. Leary had claimed them both as her protectors, her anchors in a hostile world, and neither could bring themselves to reject that role. As afternoon faded toward evening, Jonas guided the crawler up a steep incline, the vehicle's treads struggling for purchase on the icy surface. At the crest of the ridge, he brought them to a halt, staring through the viewport with an expression of disbelief. Below them, protected by encircling peaks, lay a hidden basin, unlike anything else they had seen on Sci-Fi. Instead of the endless white that dominated the planet's surface, this valley glowed with otherworldly color, patches of vibrant moss and shades of amber and gold fed by steam vents that released geothermal energy in controlled plumes rather than catastrophic eruptions. "The Moss Valley," Jonas breathed. "It's real." Sherian felt tears prick at her eyes. The scene before them was more than just a refuge from the cold. It was a miracle of adaptation and survival. These organisms had found a way to thrive in the harshest conditions imaginable, creating their own ecosystem independent of human terraforming efforts. "Down," Leary commanded, pointing imperiously toward the valley. "I want to touch the gold." Jonas laughed again, the sound coming more easily now. "As the lady wishes," he said, guiding the crawler onto a winding path that led down into the basin. As they descended, Warmth radiated upward to meet them, melting the frost that had accumulated on the crawler's exterior. By the time they reached the valley floor, the temperature outside had risen to a level that would allow brief exposure, without protective gear, a luxury unimaginable just hours earlier. Jonas brought the crawler to a stop near a particularly large mossbed, its surface glowing with bioluminescent spores that pulsed in rhythmic patterns. All around them, steam rose from natural vents in the ground, creating a perpetual misty atmosphere that softened the harsh landscape. "It's beautiful," Sherian whispered, awestruck by the contrast between this hidden paradise and the frozen wasteland that surrounded it. They spent that first night in the crawler, unwilling to venture far when darkness fell, but the following day brought exploration and discovery. The valley contained not only the glowing moss, but also several structures, remnants of a small research outpost that had been abandoned but remained largely intact. The buildings were simple but serviceable, constructed of local stone and insulated with synthetic materials designed to withstand extreme conditions. Over the next several days, they established a primitive but functional home. Sherian tended the steaming mossbeds, discovering that they could be cultivated to grow in specific patterns. She planted salvaged seed pods from their emergency rations, which flourished in the warm, nutrient-rich soil near the vents. Jonas rigged solar collectors on the south-facing slopes, capitalizing on the brief periods when the sun broke through the clouds to generate additional power. Leary, to their mutual amazement, proved to be an adept gardener. Her small fingers were perfect for the delicate work of transplanting moss shoots, and she possessed an intuitive understanding of which varieties thrived in different microenvironments within the valley. She arranged rocks into a hearth circle outside their chosen dwelling, decorating the perimeter with particularly vibrant moss specimens. As the days passed, their rhythms aligned, their movements around each other, becoming more fluid and natural. Where once they had maintained careful distance, now they worked in comfortable proximity, anticipating each other's needs, sharing tasks without discussion. Meals became communal affairs rather than necessary biological functions, with conversation flowing more freely. One evening, as they sat around the heat stone that served as the center of their outdoor gathering space, Sherian drew a small bundle from a pocket of her robes. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing 3 cloth swatches, simple squares of fabric, but clearly of significance. In memory-bearer culture, she explained, each individual carries a named cloth, a physical representation of their identity and place within the community. She held up one swatch, which bore intricate embroidery in patterns that seemed to shift and change as the fabric moved. "This is mine. It contains my lineage, my personal history, my role as a memory keeper." She handed a second, smaller swatch to Leary, who accepted it with reverent hands. This cloth bore simpler patterns, but glowed faintly with embedded bioluminescent threads. "And this is Leary's, which I began when she was born, and continue to embellish as she grows." Then, with a moment of hesitation, Sherian extended the third swatch toward Jonas. This one was new, the embroidery fresh and still incomplete, but already containing elements that echoed his journey and his choice to help them. "And this," she said softly, "is yours, if you wish to accept it." Jonas stared at the offered cloth, understanding the magnitude of what was being extended to him, not just fabric and thread, but belonging, identity, family. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for it, his first named cloth in years. "I accept," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "and I will honor what it represents." Sherian nodded, relief and joy evident in her expression. Leary, sensing the significance of the moment, climbed onto Jonas's lap and traced the patterns on his cloth with a tiny finger. "Now you're really staying," she declared, with the absolute certainty of childhood. "Forever." Jonas met Sherian's gaze over the child's head, a question in his eyes. Sherian smiled, a full, unguarded expression that transformed her face from merely beautiful to radiant. "Forever is a long time," she said gently, "but yes, we are staying together." Later that night, after Leary had fallen asleep in the small room, they had prepared for her Sherian, and Jonas sat outside beneath a rare clear sky. The stars glittered overhead, ancient and indifferent to the dramas that unfolded beneath their light. In the valley's protected microclimate, the temperature remained comfortable even after sunset, allowing them this simple luxury of stargazing. "The consensus will never stop looking," Jonas said eventually, giving voice to the concern that had lingered unspoken between them. "For Leary, for you, maybe even for me." Sherian nodded, acknowledging the truth in his words. "But they will be looking in the wrong places," she replied. "They expect us to flee off-world to hide among human populations, where anomalies might pass unnoticed. They won't expect us to make a home on the very planet from which we escaped." "A fair point," Jonas conceded. "And this valley doesn't appear on any official charts. The research station was a private initiative, its records lost when the company went bankrupt." "We can build defenses," Sherian continued, warming to the subject. "Sensors to warn us of approaching craft emergency shelters in case we need to hide. The valley provides for our physical needs. Together, we can ensure our safety." Jonas smiled, reaching out to take her hand. The gesture was new between them, intimate, in a way they hadn't yet explored, but it felt right, a physical affirmation of the connection that had formed through shared struggle and mutual respect. Together, he agreed, his fingers tightening around hers. "We'll make this work." They remained that way for some time, hands clasped beneath the stars, not hiding, but choosing to live in the open, to build something lasting in a place where no one believed life could flourish. In that moment, Sherian knew that her desperate plea in the collapsed dome had been answered, though not in the way she had expected. She had begged an indifferent universe to spare her daughter, and instead, it had sent them both a companion, a partner who understood loss and redemption, who chose to stand with them against whatever might come. The lullaby she had sung to Leary in what she believed were their final hours had spoken of journeys between stars and finding home in unlikely places. Perhaps, Sherian thought as she gazed at the man beside her, the ancient songs contained more wisdom than even memory bearers fully understood. For here, on a planet designed to kill them, they had found not just survival, but the promise of happiness, a family forged not by blood, but by choice, stronger for the trials that had brought them together. In the distance, Leary's voice called out, not in distress, but in the momentary disorientation of waking in a new place. Both adults rose, immediately moving toward the sound with matched purpose. Their hands remained linked as they entered the dwelling, ready to offer comfort and reassurance to the child who had become the center of their shared world. No longer hiding, no longer running, they faced the future together, three figures beneath the stars, exactly as Leary had drawn them, illuminated by the golden glow of a world that belonged to them alone.